We're going to be talking about ADHD today. We're going to talk about the definition of ADHD, the types of ADHD, why diagnosis is important, and possible causes of ADHD. We're also going to look at ways that children with ADHD can be helped in the public school setting, and how we can address difficult behaviors. I do want to mention that next month, on April 22nd, there will be a presentation on positive behavior supports, which students with ADHD do very well with positive behavior support. So hopefully you can join us for that presentation as well. So what is ADHD? The DSM-5, and the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the manual that mental health professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, and physicians use to diagnose certain disorders of the brain. And the DSM-5 was adopted, I believe it was mid-2013. It's been adopted for a while. It was very controversial when they were redoing the DSM from the 4 to the 5, and there were quite a few significant changes in the way that diagnoses are being done. But the DSM-5 helps physicians and mental health professionals with a medical diagnosis, and so ADHD is a medical diagnosis, just like many other disorders are. It includes behaviors that are excessive, long-term, and occur in many places. And so that is one of the criteria of the ADHD, and we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in just a minute. There are several types of ADHD. One type is inattention. There is hyperactivity and impulsivity, and there could be a combination of both of those. We're going to look at the symptoms of each of those in just a minute on another slide. It is more prevalent in boys than it is in girls, and they're not sure why that is, but it's more prevalent in boys than girls, and so is, by the way, autism spectrum disorders. And there are a lot of similar symptoms between ADHD and autism. They're very closely related in the symptoms that are displayed, and so sometimes children are diagnosed with ADHD initially and really are on the autism spectrum, or vice versa. And so we need to be aware that boys are getting diagnosed at a higher rate than girls are. Why is it important to have a diagnosis? Well, it is a medical condition, and it may require treatment of some sort. There are other ways to treat symptoms of ADHD besides just medication, although many people do find that medication is successful for them. But there are behavior modification techniques and positive behavior interventions and things like that that can help a person that has a diagnosis of ADHD. So just because it is a medical condition does not mean that it would necessarily require medication. That is a family and a parent decision. It helps families and professionals understand a child's behavior. A diagnosis can help adults understand that misbehaviors may not be deliberate or calculated. There may be a reason for the behaviors, and it may be that medical condition. They're not necessarily misbehaving or having undesirable behaviors on purpose or just because they want to, but it possibly cannot be helped. And so a diagnosis can help us understand that and help the professionals and teachers that are working with that student understand how to help that student. It identifies the need for positive instruction. Punishment may not be effective for a medical condition, and a lot of times when behaviors are undesirable, the result is punishment, sometimes instead of trying to put positives in place to teach new behaviors. What causes ADHD? Well, causes are not fully understood. Likely it is a biological difference in how the brain works, and researchers believe that there could be a biological or genetic component to it. There tends to be the disorder that may run in the family, even not necessarily immediate family, but extended family as well. And so that is an indicator that there could be biological component to it. It is a difference in brain chemistry. It's not a disease that could possibly be cured or need a cure, but it is just the way that the brain is wired differently. And again, that's very similar to those on the autism spectrum. It's a brain chemistry wiring issue that causes the symptoms of the disorder. They do know also that environment may also play a role in these behaviors. So they can't totally rule out that environment is part of it. And children, especially at a young age, are sponges that pick up and learn from observing other people and their behavior. So sometimes symptoms could mimic other behaviors that are just learned behaviors and may appear to be that different disorder. So it's important to get a qualified medical person or mental health professional to do some testing and actual evaluation and determine if this is an appropriate diagnosis for a person. Researchers now believe that children with ADHD are unable to inhibit their impulsive motor responses to sensory input. Sensory input and sensory integration is really important and critical in managing the world around us. And sometimes people cannot manage all of the sensory input. And so the theory is that children with ADHD and the brain chemistry that goes along with that are just unable to manage that sensory input and are very impulsive with it. And that's how they deal with that, through the impulsivity. Behavior begins in biology. It is not a choice necessarily. It's not just willful misconduct. It's also not bad parenting. It is probably biology and a combination of biology and learning, again, from environmental factors. And ADHD is an explanation and not an excuse. And I adopted that philosophy many years ago with my son, who has an autism spectrum disorder. But, you know, a lot of his behaviors could be explained, and his behaviors are very typical of those on the spectrum. I have an older son that also has ADHD. He'll be graduating this year, and he's, struggled with attention all the way through. And it's an explanation, but I don't use it as an excuse for the behavior. It will explain behaviors a lot of times. It will give us clues as to how to put interventions and supports in place to overcome those deficits, but I never try to use it as an excuse to excuse those behaviors. ADHD, like many other disorders, is a hidden disability. It's not obvious when you look at a person who has a diagnosis of ADHD that they have any sort of difference in their abilities or their way of learning and their way of thinking. It's not immediately obvious as it would be for a person with a physical disability that we would see. So it is a hidden disability, and that sometimes makes it even more of a challenge because we can look at a person and say, well, they look like everybody else. Why can't they act like everybody else? And that can cause some distress and some difficulty, especially for parents and for that person themselves, because they are misunderstood quite frequently out in public. And I know many of us have experienced that. We're going to look at the different types of ADHD, and I'm going to flip over to the study guide because it has a better explanation. It has a full explanation, and you will get the study guide with the handouts that I send later in the email. But in order to get a diagnosis of ADHD, there has to be in the two different areas, the inattentive or the hyperactivity impulsivity, they have to meet 6 or more symptoms from either or both. So we did mention that there can be a combination, or they can be one or the other, depending on where they fall. And this should be based on some evaluation, some sort of evaluation where we get actual data. There are diagnostic tests out there that can test for these various factors, and it generally requires input from parents and also from people that work with that child or that student. So you may be requested to get information from teachers. I know when my older son was diagnosed in middle school, we filled out information on the diagnostic criteria, and also teachers were asked to fill that out. If they're much younger, then a daycare person might be asked to fill that out, or whoever is working with that child and has knowledge about their behaviors and what's going on with them. If you can't see the handout clearly, you should be able to zoom in at the top of your screen. I did notice when I pulled this up that we do have one typo in here, and the DSM-4 was not changed to DSM-5, and I apologize for that, and I will make sure that they know about changing the curriculum at our main office. But it is the DSM-5 criteria that we're looking at for ADHD, and the child must exhibit 6 or more symptoms from either or both of A and B. So the first type is inattentive. And these are the criteria from the DSM-5 that is looked at to determine if a child is inattentive type. They often do not give close attention to details or make careless mistakes in schoolwork, work, or other activities. They often have trouble keeping attention on tasks or play activities. They often do not seem to listen when spoken to directly, and you may actually think that there is some sort of a hearing impairment when they do not respond directly when spoken to, and that's pretty common. It often does not follow through. They often do not follow through on instructions and fail to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace. And it's not due to oppositional behavior or failure to understand the instructions. They just do not understand how to follow through. And that's an executive functioning type of behavior where because of the wiring in the brain, they just cannot organize their thoughts in a logical way to complete those tasks. And so tasks need to be broken down, and we'll talk about some accommodations and things in a little while. They often have trouble organizing activities. They often avoid, dislike, or don't want to do things that take a lot of mental effort or a long period of time, such as school work or homework, and that's why students with ADHD have a real struggle getting that work done because it does take a lot of extra effort and brain power to do it. They often lose things needed for tasks and activities. They're the one that's going down the hall with all of their stuff trailing behind them, falling out of their backpacks and things, pencils and books, and never know where their assignments are and all of those sorts of things. They're often easily distracted and often forgetful in daily activities. And again, I live and breathe this with both of my children, having to remind many times about things because they can't seem to remember, you know, those things that they need to take care of. The other type is hyperactivity and impulsivity, and 6 of these are really classified as hyperactivity and 3 of them impulsivity, but they really go together. And so you have to have 6 or more of the following symptoms in this area to be classified as ADHD, the hyper and impulsivity type. The previous one, I'm going to scoot back up here for just a second. The inattentive type used to be called ADD without the H part. They've kind of combined everything into ADHD, even if there isn't a hyperactivity component. So they still call it that, but it may really be more of just the attention deficit part of it. The hyperactivity part means that they often fidget with hands or feet or squirm in the seat when sitting still is expected. They often get up from their seat when remaining in the seat is expected. They often excessively run about or climb when and where it is not appropriate. Adolescents or adults may feel very restless. This is not, just restricted to children or teenagers or adolescents. There are many adults that, also have ADHD. Often have trouble playing or doing leisure activities quietly, is often on the go or often acts as if driven by a motor, and often talks excessively. So these are the students that the teacher is complaining about them not staying in their seat. They're very fidgety. They don't pay attention. They're always up and about in the classroom. They're always on the go. I know my older son was walking at the age of 10 months and climbing out of his crib at the age of a year, and has not ever stopped since then. He's still on the go constantly. And so I totally understand that. And so you can see why some of these symptoms would be disruptive in a classroom setting. The impulsivity part is that they often blurt out answers before questions have been finished, often have trouble waiting one's turn, and often interrupts or intrudes on others, or butts into conversations or games. And so they just have that impulse control issue where they are very reactive to situations, to sensory stimulus like we talked about previously. You'll see Roman numeral 2 says that some symptoms that cause impairment were present before the age of 12 years old. So some of these symptoms have to have been present previous to the age of 12. And so part of the diagnosis procedure is going to be a medical history and asking parents, which of these symptoms were present previous to the age of 12. That children certainly can be diagnosed with this before the age of 12, but if they're getting that diagnosis after that, they're going to look back at the history. Some impairment from the symptoms is present in 2 or more settings. So you can't get the diagnosis of an ADHD if it's only evident at school and not at home, or if it's only evident at home and not at school. Or work or in the community. So it has to be in more than one setting that it is evident. And there must be clear evidence of clinically significant impairment in social, school, or work functioning. So because of the symptoms, because of the way that the brain is working, is it impairing them in social situations, in school, or in work? Is it giving them an impairment basically in day-to-day living? And if that is so, then the diagnosis of ADHD could be given. Okay, I'm going to flip back to our slides. Let me go past. Okay, so children with ADHD may be eligible for help in public schools through either special education, which is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is our federal special education law, and they typically would qualify as an eligibility of OHI or other health impairment. Remember that ADHD is a medical diagnosis. It's a medical condition, and there is a qualifier under special education with an eligibility of an other health impairment. Other health impairment requires a form that the school would provide that the doctor would sign. And we're going to talk about other health impairment here in just a second on the next slide. There's also Section 504, and I think this is kind of an introduction. Yes, so we're going to go over Section 504 here in just a minute. For the other health impaired to be a qualifier for special education, they have to have a chronic or acute health condition, which ADHD would be one of those. And I want to say that even if the symptoms are controlled by medication, the school is not, cannot require a parent to medicate a child. There is, in fact, a provision in the law in IDEA that specifically says that a school cannot require that of a parent. It is a parent's decision whether or not to medicate a student, and a school is not permitted to say they have to be medicated before they can come to school, or they have to be medicated before they can receive any type of services. So be aware that that is a provision in the law, and that the law is on the side of parents in this case, and in all cases. But it is a chronic or acute health condition. It has limited alertness to schoolwork because of the ADHD and adversely affects educational performance. In order to qualify for special education, they not only have to have a disability, but they also have to need specially designed instruction or have a educational need for instruction. So if the disorder is causing them to not be able to learn the required curriculum like every other student, then they could possibly need that special instruction, specially designed instruction. So they have to be affected both with the disability, but also have the educational need for special education and related services. We have many presentations on special education and the requirements and qualifications for that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. Certainly if you have questions about that, I'll be glad to answer those, but we do have other presentations, and some are posted in our webinar archive for your reference. ADHD and learning disabilities. A specific learning disability definition means that it exists in one or more of the processes needed to understand and use language, causing difficulty in listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, and doing math. Sometimes ADHD and people with ADHD may also have a learning disability, a specific learning disability, but not necessarily always. So just be aware that they can coexist. Learning disabilities could actually mimic some of the symptoms that ADHD present, because if they're not able to pay attention, they're not able to sit still and attend to instruction, then they quite possibly will have deficits in those academic and learning areas. That doesn't necessarily mean it is a learning disability. There needs to be testing for that. And that is why a full and individual evaluation is important. So if a student is having difficulty in school and the other types of interventions, response to intervention, RTI, various other means of accommodating a student that has difficulties are not working, then a referral for evaluation needs to be done, and they need to do a full evaluation to rule in or rule out if there is a learning disability or something else that is going on. Certainly ADHD in and of itself can qualify a student for additional help and services, but they do have to make sure that there aren't additional things going on, dyslexia, learning disabilities in reading, writing, math, any of those things. There is 13 eligibility categories under special education that students qualify for. Like I said, ADHD would fall under OHI typically, but if there is also a learning disability, then they will qualify under an eligibility for a learning disability also, which is another one of those 13 eligibilities. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is a civil rights law that the purpose of it is to provide equal access to people to be able to access their education, to access their community. 504 extends beyond the walls of the school and into the community, and it's tied closely to our ADA laws. But if a child has ADHD and is not eligible for special education, they may qualify for Section 504. ADHD interferes with learning, and if it does interfere with learning to a point where they need additional accommodations, they could qualify for 504. Section 504 is only accommodations. So the educational need portion, in order to qualify for 504, you have to have a definition of a disability, and it's a broader definition than under IDEA. And that disability needs to affect major critical life activity. So if it affects a critical life activity such as learning in school, such as participating in the community, things like that, then they would qualify for 504. 504 is only going to provide accommodations to help that person access their education. So it is not going to provide specially designed instruction, which special education does. And so if a student is, for example, below grade level and is not learning the same materials, is not able to learn the same materials as their grade level peers, that student may very well qualify for special education because they need that specially designed instruction to get them back to where they need to be and to level that playing field for them. If a student is on grade level and they're just having difficulty with all those things that we talked about, turning in work and paying attention and things like that, they may just require some additional accommodations. Be aware that 504 does not have as many regulations and rules as IDEA does. There are many, many regulations and rules under special education that are not under Section 504. And a couple weeks ago, I did a presentation just on 504, and it is in our webinar archive if you'd like to go back and listen to that entire presentation explaining Section 504. So what can parents do to help your child? You can talk to your child's teacher. I always say start at the closest point of contact to your child, and that would be their classroom teacher. and you start there and see what does that teacher need to support your child? What does that teacher need to help them achieve like every other student? Talk to the principal. If you don't get relief from talking to the teacher, then go up the chain of command and talk to the next person, which would be the principal. You can, at any time as a parent, refer your child for a special education evaluation. There are certain rules that go with that. You need to make that request in writing. It needs to go to the special education director for the school district or an administrator. There is a really good manual called the IDEA manual. There's a link to it on our website, partnerstx.org, on the home page at the bottom. And it has some great sample letters, including a sample letter for referral for initial referral for special education testing. A lot of schools there's two ways that schools tend to approach the request for testing. And sometimes a school will say, well, let's try 504 first, and then if that doesn't work, we'll do something else. Some schools will go ahead and do a full evaluation, rule out whether or not a student qualifies for special education, and then provide 504 accommodations. And so I'm going to talk about a few of the types of accommodations, and I'll include a really good list that Chuck, our education specialist, had provided for the 504 that he did and talked about, and so I'll include that in the email to you. But it's a very good inclusive list of accommodations that could be considered. You could talk to your district Section 504 coordinator. Every district has a 504 coordinator. Every school is supposed to have somebody that oversees the 504 in their school. You can request accommodations, and you can request an behavior intervention plan. You do not have to be a student receiving special education services to get a behavior intervention plan. That can be done for any student, even in the general education setting. Schools don't tend to realize that, I guess, or do not approach it that way, but a behavior intervention plan can be put in place for any student that needs some additional support. Behavior intervention plans are supposed to be positive in nature to work on changing the undesirable behavior and replacing it with a more desirable behavior, and it's a plan for that based on positive interventions, not necessarily punishment and punitive type interventions. So what are some types of accommodations that a student with ADHD might need? Well, they might need to sit close to the point of instruction. It's interesting to me in observing classrooms how the student that is disruptive and is out of their seat and can't sit still and all of that is put in the back of the classroom so that they're not a distraction to other students, when in reality they really need to be right under the teacher's thumb. They need to be right in front of the teacher because it's going to help them not only pay attention, but it's also going to help that teacher be able to refocus and keep that student on task better. If they can just touch them on the shoulder, or they can just put their hand on the desk to redirect the attention to that. They may need reduced homework load. They may need extra time for assignments. They may need testing in small groups or individually in order to be successful. They may need frequent breaks because of the inability to sit still if they have that hyperactivity component. They may need their assignments to be chunked. Chunking of an assignment is not necessarily reducing the amount of work required in the assignment, but it breaks it down into smaller chunks or smaller pieces that they can work on. So an intervention could be in place for the student to, okay, we're going to do these five problems for math, and then you can take a 1-minute break, and maybe they have a fidget or something that they can do for a minute. Maybe they need to get up and walk around their desk 3 times, who knows, whatever it is for that student. And then we're going to sit down and do 5 more. So we're chunking it and breaking it up into smaller pieces that are manageable for that student, and that's a great accommodation. And then a positive behavior plan is also an intervention. There are lots and lots of different types of accommodations that could be put in place, not only for students receiving special education services, but also under that 504. So what else can parents do to help their child in the community? Oh, sorry, I'm looking at my notes and I want to go back up. I apologize. I want to mention that we often hear, and as parents, when we bring up that there are issues and that the child is having difficulty in school, and right away we hear, okay, well, we're gonna try response to intervention, or RTI. And RTI is very good, and it is research-based. It is designed to provide intensive additional instruction in whatever area of need that student has. It is data-driven, and they're supposed to be collecting a lot of good data to see how the student is responding to intervention. But I want to mention that and response to intervention is good, and it's going to give a lot of information, but it cannot be used by a school to deny a parent's request for an evaluation or to delay an evaluation if it is needed. And so just be aware that RTI is supposed to be a short-term intervention. It is not supposed to go on and on year after year that a student is receiving those the RTI types of interventions. If after a certain period of time, and for most school districts it is about half of a school year, if that student is not responding to those interventions, then they need additional supports and services, and an evaluation should be done when they reach that 3rd tier. RTI is a tier process where they work through 3 tiers, and once they reach that 3rd tier with the interventions and intensive interventions, then often those interventions are not helping that student enough to warrant continuing with that, and evaluation for other services should be initiated at that time. Okay, so what can we do at home and in the community? Well, lots of praise and encouragement. Catch them being good. Ignore minor misbehaviors and use positives first. And I did mention previously that positive interventions are very successful for students with ADHD, for students on the autism spectrum, and various other types of disorders. It has to do with identifying the root cause or the need that behavior is seeking, and then filling that need in a different way, in an appropriate way. So there's always a reason for the behavior. It's just trying to figure out what the reason is. Again, remember, they're not necessarily doing it on purpose. It's a medical diagnosis, and they may not be able to help their behaviors. And so we have to keep that in mind. Understand consequences. We need to understand as a parent and also as a professional or a teacher that sometimes we inadvertently reinforce the behaviors that we do not desire, those undesirable negative behaviors. And if a behavior is reinforced, positive or negative, it will tend to reoccur. And so we have to go back and look at what is occurring before that behavior, and is there a pattern to it, and try to determine, maybe it's something that we are doing prior to the behavior, and then what are we doing after the behavior as a consequence? Are we reinforcing that behavior? Excuse me, or Are we ignoring the behavior, or what exactly are we doing to deal with that particular behavior? So we need to understand that sometimes we are reinforcing the behavior that we don't desire. So part of determining that is figuring out what can we do on the front side before a behavior occurs. Just as an example, with my younger son, who is on the autism spectrum, when he was much younger, he has difficulty, even still, and just always will, with transitioning to another activity. So it takes some preparation ahead of time to let him know when we're going to be changing activity. So if we would be, when he was younger, if we would be at the playground and he's playing and busy and having a good time, and I know that we're going to be leaving in 10 minutes, then I have to give him a warning and say, we're going to be leaving in 10 minutes. And then later on, I'll say, okay, 5 minutes. And that's not necessarily going to avert the meltdown that's going to occur when the 5 minutes is up, but it does help him think ahead of time and process that information. Does not like, an immediate change, and many children are like that. Many children with the ADHD, they have a hard time shifting focus to something else that they may be focused on. We learned very early on, do not put Thomas the Tank Engine video in before school, because you will have a meltdown if we have to stop in the middle of the video. So it's just things that we learn as a parent to adapt and to have to think ahead to prevent that behavior from occurring when we know that it will occur based on a certain thing, and what the consequence would be. It's important to use consequences that work and that are meaningful, and we'll talk again in a couple weeks about positive behavior interventions and all the ins and outs of behavior. Give them frequent feedback and strive for consistency, and that's really hard. I know it's hard as a parent to be consistent, to follow through, and to do what we say we're going to do. And so if we give a warning for something, we have to follow through on that, which is really difficult. There's going to be some good suggestions in the study guide that will be coming with the materials that I send. We can provide structure. There are things like schedules that kids do really well with, checklists, picture schedules. Some children really need to have the visual, especially when they're younger, to understand what is next, what is happening, what is expected of me. A lot of times if a student or a child does not know what is expected of them, it hasn't been explained at school or it hasn't been explained at home, well, they're just going to make up whatever they want to do. If you haven't told me differently and I don't know what is expected of me, then I'm going to figure it out on my own. And so structured environment is very helpful. And it's harder, I know, to structure the home. School is much easier to structure because you have a routine and a schedule and things that you're following, and it's typically the same from day to day, whereas home is not. But we still can put certain things in place to structure certain activities, to teach responsibility, to have chores, and to know what is expected in the home. Develop a home routine. Do they have certain responsibilities at home? I know my son is the one that is responsible for collecting the garbage around the house, and that's part of his job. Part of his job is making sure the dogs have food, things like that. Post the house rules and make sure, put them on the refrigerator or on the wall, and make sure that they understand, again, the expectations, because if they don't know what is expected, they will make up their own rules. Be as consistent as possible. Again, that consistency is difficult, but it needs to be consistent, if possible, across settings. I know that I have found this to be true with my own children, especially the one on the spectrum, but there has to be consistency. So if something works at school and works well at school, it can also work at home. I'll give you an example. Back when my son was in first grade, which was many years ago because he's a freshman now, the teacher told me about a method that they used to switch gears and move to a new activity. So if they were going to be lining up to go to PE, the teacher would say, okay, we're going to go to PE, you have until the count of 5, and they would start counting down from 5, and they would just say 5, 4, 3, and by the time she gets to 1, everybody should be moved to the line and where they're supposed to be. So she told me about this, and my son was responding. You know, he was doing what everybody else was supposed to be doing, and he was getting in line like he should, and he understood how that was working in the classroom. And so I was at home one day after she had told me this, and we were going to transition to some other activity, and he was refusing and digging his feet in. And so I just very calmly, I just started counting backwards, and I just said 5, 4, and boy, his eyes got as big as saucers, because all of a sudden it kind of dawned on him. He was like, wait a minute, this is mom, this is not teacher. What is she doing the same thing as teacher? And he didn't like that, actually, at first. It really did, because he knew that there were consequences when 1 was reached and you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing. So it actually was very effective at home also. And so that consistency between those settings, between school and home, visit with teachers, find out what they do if they're being successful. Teachers need to ask parents, you know, if you're being successful at home, what is working for you? Maybe that can be incorporated also into the classroom, because they need that consistency across settings, which is important. And then plan ahead for problems. And I've already given you some examples of that. Planning ahead, warning them ahead of time, not just saying all of a sudden drop everything and let's go, but give them a warning. Not to say that you're not going to still have some issues when you reach that point, whatever it is. Timers are very helpful, and we've used timers many times in our home and at school, because then the timer is the bad guy and not mom or dad or teacher. And so even just a kitchen timer that they can see ticking down the time. There's visual timers you can get that tick down the time, and timers are really good about helping kids, especially ones that don't have an idea of how to manage their time, or even an understanding of time, to be able to see it, and it makes it more real. And so timers are really good, because they can, and now with smartphones we have apps that are timers, and you can just see it counting down, and so they would know that, okay, this is how much time I have, the time is disappearing, it's time to go now. And so timers are a really great tool to use. Things to avoid: emotional debates with your child, taking things personally, and inconsistent consequences. That inconsistency really it's hard. I understand that it's very hard to be consistent and to follow through on what we say we're going to do, and follow through with a consequence. It is difficult, but it's important that we can do that. And the emotional debates and bargaining and things usually never work. And so never give up is really important, and strive to get that consistency in the home and at school. And just know that there are interventions that can help, that there are things that can be done at school to help. I'm going to send you with the email some additional links. There is a really good, I went to a workshop, I think it's been 2 years ago now, but there is a website called behaviordoctor.org, and she does workshops and things, but she has some really great tools and suggestions for different disorders, including ADHD. Okay, so I have a question. Let me put my little question mark bulb up here. If a child entering school has a medical diagnosis for ADHD and a recommendation from a developmental pediatrician for IDEA, does the school have to consider the doctor's recommendation and evaluation? That's a really good question, actually. They should consider it, but saying that they should is not necessarily what's going to happen. But that does give a parent some, I guess, fuel, you might want to call it, for getting some additional help. And so just because a doctor does recommend it, there's a difference between the medical need and the educational need. We talked about that ADHD is a medical condition, but it also has that education component to it. And so the school is concerned with educational need. Doctors are concerned with medical need. We have to bridge that gap and try and bring it together. So an evaluation is what is going to determine if there is that educational need. So they need to do the educational testing. Now, I want to say something about this because part of IDEA is that they have to also look at functional needs. So it is not only academics. An educational need is not just reading, writing, and math. Educational need also includes, can you function in your environment in order to learn? Or does your disability keep you from learning like your non-disabled peer? So if you have a disability that affects how you are learning, and my son is on grade level. He's always been on grade level. We have worked really hard from the very beginning to keep him in the general education class and keep him on grade level. He's a high functioning student. He, granted, has an autism spectrum disorder, but he's very bright. He has average intelligence. There's no reason why he can't learn like everybody else, but he does have issues and difficulties and challenges that we have to accommodate for him so that he can learn. And so that is the functional part. He's never had academic IEP goals, ever, because he is on grade level, yet he still qualifies for those services because his disability keeps him functionally from participating in the classroom like a non-disabled peer does, to provide that. So it's really important that we understand that they can't just look at a student and go, oh, they have all A's and B's. This whole attitude of a student needing to fail before they get services, that is not what the law says. There is nothing in the law that says that a student has to be failing before we can provide services. If they are struggling and they are having difficulty with the learning, there needs to be some accommodations put in place, either under IDEA or 504. So I hope that answers that question. It's important, but we have to remember the medical versus the educational. If you have additional questions, please feel free to put those up there, and I'll try to answer any questions. These are some websites. Of course, our website is at the top, and we do have some great resources there. And these are some other places where you can go for resources. This presentation was adapted from one that PACER does, which is also a parent training and information center, just like Partners, up in Minnesota, and they have some really good online trainings on their website. And this is information about all of our projects. We do serve the entire state with 3 different grant projects, and you can get information about who serves you locally on our website.